held my position for 5 years. And I miss her so much. I can't wait for her to come back as a volunteer.
We miss you, Abigail.
And there were two kinds of convenings, right? There were the national ones, like the Encuentro and the Carnaval, but then we also held regional ones. There was a regional convening in New York, one in Seattle, Pacific Northwest, one in Dallas, and most recently, the last one of that cycle was Miami, held in July. And something that we learned quickly coming out of Seattle and have refined sort of the difference between a regional convening and a national one that are both under the auspices of the LTC, is learning how to, the way everything must prioritize the regional conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Even though folks are coming from those regions or sitting on the steering committee, there's still the amount that you have to really think about going deeply and letting the convening come from the community rather than us bringing it to them.
Yeah.
Was super important. And so everything from consider the way that the invites go out or the emails, the partners that we choose to go with first, to the way that the calendar is set, because in Seattle was also the first time that the LTC was thinking about strategic planning, and so there was an in-person steering committee meeting that was planned, but what ended up happening was that the national convening took up a giant slot on the calendar, and so the regional folks, we kind of brought them in, and then there was a closed door, and then there was going back into it, and over time we figured out how to keep that balance better of continuing to hold the regional space, and taking advantage of bringing people together from the steering committee in person, because a lot of our work is done virtually on Zoom. I'm fully remote. I take calls on trains and coffee shops and my kitchen everywhere. And so so over time, I think refining all of those things, there was so much learning. We have a document of wisdom that just accumulates all of this that Abigail set up. And so
a document of wisdom.
Yeah.
That's so good. We're gonna pass the mic to Idris, but I want to name that Latinx Theater Commons in some way comes out of some really old school organizing traditions of Latinx communities, and I just personally feel like y'all are way ahead sometimes, but because you're able to draw on those traditions, those organizing traditions that are so historically powerful, and just a lot to learn from. So please pass the mic to Idris, and we're gonna, I know you're here to represent all the things.
So I'm glad we're at evolution, because I don't have much history to rely upon. I'm not sure the age of the organizations that I'm representing, and I'm not a member of any of them except for BTN, and I think now the Black Theater Commons, because on the West Coast there's a bit of a disconnect from a lot of the Black theater organizations which exist either in the middle or on the East Coast. And Joni spoke to the multiculturalism that we enjoy out here. I think has us focusing a bit more on the work itself from project to project as opposed to looking at coalition building. I think our only coalition here is ATTAIN, which just began as the Association of Theaters of African Descent, something that Idris Ackamore began. But again, BACCE is not a part of that either, because we tend to veer more into the queer community, so our alliances are more inside the queer community depending on the work. And we just produced El Rio, which was a bilingual Latinx production, and we are in the Mission, so we are quite naturally more focused on the project. That, I think, needs to change, and being one of the older traditions of theaters of color, Black theater, we have a lot, I think, to contribute to each other. And I think that once we're looking now for the West Coast delegation to attend Black Theater Commons, which is happening in the summer, and the Black Theater Network, which is also happening next summer. I do know Black Theater Commons has its origins in August Wilson's essay, The Ground on Which I Stand, and that is one of the guiding documents that, so he created that out of the Black Theater Commons at Dartmouth, and so the Commons is again returned to Dartmouth last year, and will come again. I think they started in maybe 2016, they revitalized it. But again, on the West Coast, we don't even, en masse, attend the National Black Theater Festival, which is the largest organization, I think, convening of people of color. I think the number went into the tens of thousands 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, and Rotimi Ababiak and I were there, and Rodessa Jones and Donald Lacey were there. We were the only people from Northern California that were there. There were a few people from Southern California that we hooked up with, but largely that gathering has happened on the East Coast, unbeknownst to a lot of Black theater practitioners here. So we're just starting to wake up. But it's a great gathering, and I think a lot of the coalitions that we have happened at night over drinks at that place. So I think one of the things, every time I see a festival of people of color, I get jealous. Every time I see the Latin Theater Commons, or I see ReOrient, I'm like, we need that. We need so many more. And part of that yearning, I think, is just for space to be together, to know who each other is, what we're working on, and because the National Black Theater Festival is 7 days long, and people are there for the duration, it's Winston-Salem, and there's quite nothing else to do, that we have a lot of time to do coalition building. And so I wanted to give a shout out to Monica Ndunu, who asked me to come here, who's convening the BTC next year, and has asked me to help her identify a delegation from the West Coast so that we can become more involved. And I think we're at the place where we want to reinvent the wheel somewhat. Because I feel there, and Monica and I talked about this, that there are Black people in all y'all's spaces,
Yes.
right? So there are Black Asians, there's Black Middle Easterners, there are Black Latinos, and they a lot of times end up in our space without those connections being made across culture. And so one of the things that Monica at the Craft Institute has done, two things she's doing. One is the Black Vitality Commission is looking to bring together leaders of all these different Black coalitions. And I've been a part of a few at the August Wilson Center, one at Amherst, one that was at Penn State. This was about 10 or 15 years ago. And part of it is that we all went back to our little holes, and we never met again, or we subsumed into these other groups. So there can be a too generous of a coalition. Like we have too many, and then we get spread out so thin, or one falls by the wayside and we jump on the other. And so the Black Vitality Commission is looking to bring together the leadership and to create programs, actual programs around diaspora, which would include Black Latino, Black Native, Black. And so there's actually, she told me there's an African diasporic state that has been created, a state like Connecticut, that is going to have like a governor and a full, so that the diaspora has an actual home to call their own, which is really something amazing. And then the other thing that she's looking at is cross-cultural collaboration. So there's one of the reasons we gather is to protect our work, and I would say here in the Bay Area, a lot of Black plays get done. But we have one historically Black theater, two actually, one which is Lorraine Hansberry, which lost their leadership about a decade ago and has been struggling ever since, and a little known theater called the Lower Bottom Players, run by Ayodele and Zinga in Oakland, in West Oakland, who has done the entire August Wilson cycle twice, I believe. And yeah, so, and then my theater company And so we call ourselves Black also. So I think Black has to do with,
Yeah.
oh, and African American Shakespeare, thank you, African American Shakespeare. And so those are the 4 companies that exist here on the West Coast, connecting to the larger, both to the larger Black networks, but also this idea of cross-cultural collaboration and the protection of the work. And so there's been a lot of controversy about Black work being done at white theaters here. And so why not entrust the work cross-culturally? Why not entrust the Black work to the Latin Theater Company? Why not entrust the work to MENA? Why not MENA entrust the work to BTC? So that we have some kind of community agreements and principles that we're upholding, and we don't have to create this kind of energy around white theater companies receiving funding, receiving audiences, or all the kind of what we call vampirism that tends to happen intentionally or not around the structures that are here and how we have to work within them. And so Craft Institute is creating a rolling premiere and is looking actually for work like El Rio, which has at its heart a Black Seminole character, is leading a Guatemalan refugee across the border, and is written almost entirely in Spanish and has some Gullah words and I'm forgetting the Guatemalan language, that the name of it, but it was trilingual actually. Yeah, Chech. Yeah, thank you. And so we embarked on that work because white theaters weren't able to sort of understand. They kept wanting to make the corridor into like 5 or 6 characters, when it was really clearly a tradition that, as an African American, I understood that El Rio, the river, was embodying these characters and was moving the action. And the number of theaters that Andrew Saito, the playwright, sent it to, kept trying to collapse it and fix it into a more westernized structure. And so it ended up in my lap because I kept saying, it's a perfect play, just the way it is, it's perfect, let's just do it. And he said, are you sure? Because like so-and-so down in San Diego rep said this. And so I think that this rolling premiere network might be a great place at the Craft Institute to start to look at how we can be more inclusive in our interpretations and even in how we're perceiving the projects that we're perceiving across each other's culture.
This is great. You said so much, Edris. This is
Okay.
so fabulous. I want to just, I want to lift up some things. First of all, going back to some of the challenges that you named at the beginning about how, particularly with Black theater, the regional differences are really big because the regional histories of African Americans in this country are so different in different parts of the country, right?
Yeah.
And so it was really interesting to hear you talk about California and how the experience here is different, but also the kind of regional isolation that can happen, and how we all need to be mindful of that if we're trying to create truly national coalitions. How do we do that really is accessible and inclusive to everyone, right? And I think Kata's had that challenge as well. But you quite organically led us into the next part of the conversation that I want to have, which is about how do we, across identity groups, across networks, support each other's work? Because you quite rightfully said that, what often happens with work by artists of color is that kind of predominantly white institutions are still the center of all the exchange, of all the rolling premieres, of all the major funding that goes into them, of quote unquote audience development initiatives, right?
Yeah.
And all that. And what if we just, to quote Ngugi wa Thiong'o, just move the center?
Yeah.
Move the center.
Yeah.
And we all start to work with each other.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, this was exactly the idea that Monica and I were talking about, is that then those who were previously at the center, being on the edge of all this work, would have to come through us. to create the work. And I also want to just say that the Black Vitality Commission is also looking across platforms. And so the leaders that come together are also film directors and people who are creating on YouTube and creating in on other platforms, because there's a crossover and there's also more money sometimes on the film end. So how do we create these projects that go from theater to film without losing that continuity, without losing that connection, and without losing that cultural strength that was created inside the community building space that theater is. Once it gets to a screenwriter's hands or in Hollywood, how about if that person comes also out of our coalition? And we're able to also create alternative revenue streams through that process also.
Wow.
Resources.
That's awesome. Yeah, go ahead, clap. You can clap. So I'm gonna bring Armando and Joan back into the conversation around this this question of how are we gonna work together across networks and identity groups more, and understanding that we're already there, right?
We're
Like, I love
Yeah.
that we're already in each other's communities,
Yeah.
right? Identity is so complex in
I
the
think
21st century.
Really here.
Oh wait, use the mic.
Oh, sorry. I think really here, I don't know how much it's like that but here, with Campo Santo, I work with Campo Santo, Joan works at Brava, like we are out of maybe just how small we are, maybe, that we all know each other and we all love to work together, that we tend to create projects that cross each other's culture in an effort to work with that person we want to work with. But it also is part of our strength. We have limited resources, we have limited spaces. And so, and we were born together. Campo Santo and BACC were born together out of Intersection for the Arts. And we have the same mothers and fathers and grandfathers. And Rene Yanez is the godfather of everybody. And so we sort of are naturally in the house together a lot with each other. And so I think that we naturally do that. How can we help that become a national movement? How can that become the way we work nationally? And I think this was the importance of why Monica wanted a West Coast delegation to be at BTC, was to talk about how the project itself, the project that you choose, is actually the beginning of creating that cross-cultural, yeah.
Yeah, when I think of cross-culture, I think of Leslie Ishii and another amazing human, because her approach is so intentional. I remember her coming to, she comes to as many LTC convenings as she can.
Yes.
And walks into the room carrying and being aware of the way that when she's visiting in a space, how that's not a neutral act. And how to, like, that balance or that awareness of the taking and the contribution. And so I just want to raise that up, and I will definitely be at Kata in Hawaii.
Yes.
And we're trying to figure out how to get the finances to send a small contingent of LTC folks too.
Little plug, we want to have a conversation about statehood with some Puerto Rican folks and Hawaiian folks. So there are definitely things that, like, across our communities we need to be talking about and learning from each other on, for sure.
I wanted to say what you were talking about in terms of, like, the kind of co-creation and holding each other's work and trusting each other with that work. I think it is a function of, like, a lot of the West Coast is so multicultural. And so a lot of our organizations and artists have been working together, across those, like, kind of, I wouldn't even say cultural divides, but the commonalities.
The intersectionality.
The intersectionality, yeah. And so it comes more as a natural, it feels more natural here. And so, but I love the the idea of formalizing that kind of a network in terms of really starting at the artistic basis for it, you know, which is the work itself. Because I think a lot of times in coalition building, we get into these conference settings and we do have to keep our, you know, minds like on building infrastructure and what are those structures. But at the heart of it, we're all here because we love the work. We're all here because we're theater makers, or we love theater and this kind of multidisciplinary, like, you know, performance work that we all support. And because we think that artists and culture have this intrinsic value in like our lives. So I think starting back at like the, you know, doing the work is a really beautiful way of just like showing rather than telling. Yeah. So, yay.
I want to open it up in just a moment to audience questions and conversation. But so I would like to know, for in this context of us here in the MENA community being kind of at the beginning of network or coalition or alliance or consortium, or we're still trying to figure out what it is.
Commons.
Building commons, yes. What, from the point of view of the networks that you've been connected with, like, what advice would you offer to us about, you know, both coming from the challenges and also the successes? Like, what are the things that you would say, oh yeah, definitely do this, or definitely don't do that? Like some, you know, some advice that you could give about this work of network or coalition building.
I think it's important to have off time for people to speak and to meet each other and to just like eat food and have a cocktail and talk. That's really important, because sometimes we go to conferences and every day is packed with a workshop or something you want to go to. And I don't mean just lunch, but like an afternoon of mingling time. I feel like that's really important. And I think being really clear and about, I like that you have closed sessions. I think that's really important to be able to speak openly. And then I think also to the open sessions, to really see who's in the room and recognize the potential of the people who are in the room, who may not look like what you thought should be in that room.
Yes.
But that, you know, why are you here and what's your interest? I say that out of the idea too that blacks, we open the door to whoever is interested in black people. And if you have a real interest, because the work is going to submerge you in that already. And so you're going to be a little more blacker when you leave the room than you were when you came in. And as if we really know what that is, but we have an idea. we know when it walks through. It's collard greens and cornbread. We know what that is. But that bit, but expansiveness and expanding and keeping that. That's so interesting. Keeping it. That I said two very contradictory things, but you get it. The theater artist and the ambiguity.
Early on, the LTC convenings were notoriously like jam-packed. Because the Latino Theater Company produced the Encuentro Theater Festival, it was 4 weeks long. It had 19 theater companies.
Yeah.
Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Concurrently, all of the companies were mixed into 10 labs. So talking about getting to know each other through the work, they were exchanging artistic creation methodologies with each other in those labs. And in I think it was the third weekend, there was a weekend in the middle of the festival when all of the companies, or mostly all of the companies, were gonna be there, because there were some that were just there for the first 2 weeks, some just for the second 2 weeks. But we at the LTC brought in, I think it was like 60-something folks to convene at the festival. So on top of the theater companies and all the artists that were part of theater companies, we brought in more folks. And the schedule flipped around so that everybody could see all of the shows in 3 days. Plus parties, so we did get those in. Plus lunch, and then Don Francisco Coffee was really generous and kept everybody caffeinated. But it's like
Didn't I sleep? I'm just like.
no. Very little. And so the programmed time together, but then also the unprogrammed time when folks can choose their own adventure and figure out who to have that drink with or can take time for themselves. Because it also becomes then a question of accessibility, right? Those marathon days and being in dark spaces and with a lot of folks. So keeping all of that in mind, we revved the engine really hard, but then figured out to, because we're so hungry to be in these spaces with each other. We want to squeeze as much time, but then also honoring our human bodies. Is really
The intro had people on fire all over the West Coast when it was in LA.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to come. We were all figuring out, brushing up on our Spanish. I was in that room.
Jody, for talk about Kata?
Yes, and yes, like all the same things, which is, it's true, like when you get into that space and when you have the privilege of getting to design that space and having all of this intention in the space, it's like, it's hard not to program every single minute. Because it is so precious to have the time together, to be in rooms where it is just us. It's like people have come, it's like for a lot of the younger folks who come into the kind of conference setting, and it's, honestly, they're saying, this is the first time I've been in this type of space. And so to know that that's something that we take very seriously and want to make fun and, beneficial to folks. But there also is that thing about understanding the culture of the place that you're in, which we want to leave time, leave space, leave ritual for, if people want to engage in that. And so I think that's a really important thing that we like to do within Kata is when we are in the place, it's like really honoring, what is there that probably is unseen by most people. And so I think that makes our time together really special, and we can also, with the spaces that we're in, that there's something that is of us that is left behind, and that we can continue to build on. So that's kind of aspirational, and that would be the advice.
There's something I want to lift up about the Kata Confest that's coming up in August 2020 on Oahu in Hawaii, is that it's a really interesting shift for Kata because it's the first time when we're going to be in a place where indigenous culture can be centered. Because here on the continent, we talk a lot about immigration and migration, and everything shifts when we go to Hawaii. And even for board members and conference planners to figure out, to understand, not figure out, but to truly understand what does that mean, and how do we need to check our own behavior to truly be in solidarity and truly center indigenous leadership. It's a really beautiful new challenge. And it's also going to be full of some really complex conversations about indigeneity and colonization and immigration and all of our various, very complicated histories.
I dream of a day, actually, when the National Black Theater Festival would dare to land in Africa. I just think about what you're saying, is that the power. I wanted to add two things that I learned from the Institute of Directing and Ensemble Creation. One was about community agreements. That would be another piece of advice, community agreements. And the other thing that happened that was profound there was that the non-melanated conversation didn't happen.
Can you explain what does that mean for viewers?
The white people weren't in the room, but the thought of them wasn't there. We were talking about ourselves only. And so my advice would be to push in that direction as far as you can, to leave the dominant culture out of the room. And then that's a way of also just recentering everything.
And let me just say, that's so interesting to me that you just said that, because actually we did have white folks in the room, but we had white allies who were committed
Yeah.
to being allies in
Yeah.
that space,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so it doesn't, again, it's about who's at the center
Yes.
and who is their space for.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be exclusionary, it has to be about, we're all showing up committed
Yeah.
to this,
And I
to
mean,
this
not
mission.
necessarily physically, but the conversations that
That's
you
right.
have are not always about what the others are doing.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna open it up to some questions and comments from all of you who've been listening so patiently. I'm not sure if we can have somebody help with running a mic. Thank you. Yeah, and we have about another 25 minutes to have some conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. I know that we're here talking about MENA or whatever we're going to call it, coalition, but I would like to know when we're going to have the American POC coalition, because that sounds like what we really want in general.
Just wanna say something about that?
Yeah. So, you know, we have really endeavored to try to build a people of color commons and coalition. I think we're just right now at the beginning of that. But there are like larger questions that as people of color in this country that we want to be able to rely on each other for. And you know, a lot of what Edris was saying about not doing it in like, the conversation isn't centered on, you know, white culture, white, in terms of who is holding power, but it's like, what are we building for ourselves? And so I think that is something that, beyond like building a coalition where you're in affinity with a group that you have like all this commonality with, and you want to do some work, that there is also that other part about reaching across coalitions in order to build something larger. And I think that's the same idea that we mostly get from our own cultures and communities, because we work so collaboratively together. And so it's kind of like ingrained, I think, in a lot of us to do that. But I think there are like aspirations. We've heard from, you know, Edris about the work that they're doing around building that also. And so I think that that's something that I think is a big desire of a lot of folks in the room.
You know, I want to say too that there's a little bit of trepidation in that concept, because it does sort of recenter ourselves as minorities in a way, as opposed to when we're at the Black Theater Festival, it's us. And that I think it would want to be an organic and centered around real work, and not a place where funding is parceled out or that kind of thing, where it can so easily go so wrong. Yeah.
Well, and also it could go wrong because we don't fully understand each other's histories and current political realities, cultures and challenges yet, right? So I feel like there's so much work in that aspirational goal. There's so much work to do. I mean, even within an identity group, which isn't really an identity group, it's such as Middle Eastern and North African, it's full of so many identities, or Asian American, or Latinx, right? Or all the different identities in Blackness, right?
Yeah.
There's so much learning to do from each other within, and we need that time, and we need that time to build community and to build collective power. And then we also need to do that work across communities in a way. I mean, we carry stereotypes about each other as people of color. Often we have, you know, we have racism we have anti-blackness in Middle Eastern communities, right? I'm not gonna lie about that, right?
Yeah.
Classism too.
Right, and of course, other isms, classism, ableism, all these things, right? But I'm excited about the aspiration. I also want to be like really grounded about like the work
Yeah.
that we need to do
Yeah.
to do it well, so it
Yeah.
doesn't just go haywire.
So, I mean, in the same spirit of this conversation, I really appreciate, I love the idea of shifting the center, of bypassing the white theater companies and turning to each other, and considering creating a decolonized space for making theater amongst all of our communities, and having these conversations with each other, a decolonized anti-racist space.
Yeah, so I just wanted the complication we have here too in the Bay Area is that a lot of what we're calling white theater companies are actually run by people of color. Yeah, so what do you call, it's the San Francisco White People Black Theater Company, because they have black leadership and their plays skewer towards African American ideas sometimes because of who's in the room, but that's just a little bone here.
We have a
We have it.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, so I had a question. I loved what you all were talking about in terms of like activating regional activity. And I had a question about transparency and accountability between like a regional level and a national level, and like how that structure looks for each of you. If you have any insight, that would be great.
Yeah. So before I was part of the LTC steering committee, I was a co-founder along with many folks in Los Angeles of the Latino Theater Alliance of LA. And we kind of modeled ourselves after the Alliance of Latino Theater Artists, Alta Chicago. And I think, so they're satellites we have a lot of crossover. When I was at the LTCLA, we were just on our own. It was like there was a plugging in to the LTC through individual members who would keep us apprised of what was going on at the national level. But we were holding our own convenings. We were meeting each other in LA in our different spaces and seeing the work. So they were running in parallel. Right now we're talking about what it looked like for the LTC to convene a roundtable of the alliances where they're at now. A lot of them are in transition. Several of us who were there in LA who were leading those conversations have gone off to do other things in different parts of the country. And in Chicago, the leadership changed over as well. And so we're reaching out to see what it would look like to bring each other together, or to bring everyone together on a call. But there isn't a formal tether from LTC to the regional alliances, except for the fact that we're a lot of the same folks in both rooms. Yes.
I wanted to also say that for us, we don't have like a set structure in terms of regionally, because we're working as kind of a national board. We did want to kind of really look at regions as a way to keep in contact with our membership or with folks who are interested in what we were doing. But it's not, not something that exists right now. And when you ask about accountability, I think, that takes structure, meaning people, persons to, and a clear, like, what is the role, what is the goal, in terms of like the national part of the work. It's like, what are you hoping to achieve? And then the last part, which is really hard to get to, is how do you evaluate that? In order to have a system of accountability, in general sense, you have to be able to assess it, like, according to a standard. And so that's a really hard thing for organizations that don't have infrastructure or don't have like, like an evaluation kind of rubric for their work. I think, sure you've gone through this with LTC much more than like any one of these other.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I would say that there's, not yet. I think that's part of what Monica and I were talking about, is about working on the regions. Because there hasn't even been, in the Black Theater Coalitions, a real recognition of regionalism. Everybody's sort of been lumped into the idea of Black theater, and sometimes there are companies, I think our company included, that feels a little left out of the conversation because it doesn't include queer work often. It doesn't include African work, of which that's a strong, our company is strongly Nigerian, queer Nigerian. Yeah, so where do we go? Yeah.
Okay.
So,
And then
yeah, just to offer a different example, Adriana Gaviria on the steering committee championed the Miami convening, and there hadn't been an energy to convene regionally the folks in South Florida, and that I'm aware of, or that folks are aware of in the Latinx space, and so specifically theater, because I think that there had been convenings that were all arts, but specifically Latinx theater, and going back to the idea of you leave something behind when you convene in a space, folks there were energized to form a regional alliance, and we just have to be prepared to leave the necessary tools that we have for them to self-organize.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your experiences. I think it's the convening has really come alive. And I wish so much that Shannon was a part of this conversation.
Yes.
Because I think
yes.
the experiences of Native artists is so important to this conversation. My question, I'm a writer based in Los Angeles, and I wanted to know, two-part question, what your recommendations were for like upcoming conferences. I know Kata's coming up, so if there's any other events or gatherings that you might want to shout out or just share. And perhaps, why did I say perhaps? Maybe some theaters that you could recommend for us to submit to, so that we can continue this crossover.
Well, there's the BTC, the Black Theater Commons, is happening at Dartmouth in the summer of 2020. And so is the Black Theater Network. It's happening in, do you know where it is? I'm forgetting. I'll remember before we leave, hopefully. And also, there's a Women's Theater Festival happening in San Francisco at Bravo. I'm not sure the date of that, but I know that they're
March
planning.
and April.
March and April 2020. Great, thank you.
So what I said earlier, we produced 11 convenings in 6 years. We had a separate strategic planning meeting last year in 2018 at Princeton during the Fornes Symposium that we produced, and there was a recommendation that came out of that to
Stop convening.
we're not gonna stop. To have a longer throw in between convenings. And so our next convening will be close to the LTC. We're doing a creative renewal retreat that's for the steering committee and advisory committee folks, so that we can realign ourselves as we enter a new generation of steering committee, where many of the people who were there in the beginning are not there on the committee now. And in the next couple of weeks, I'll be able to tell you one that the LTC will be doing in 2021, but we'll have to leave it at that for now.
Okay.
As far as like opportunities, well, I think I got two really good ones, which are the National Performance Network is holding their annual conference, December 10th through 13th in New Orleans. As I spoke about, like there are lots of cultural, what I call cultural centers of color, who attend that conference. It's really amazing, this network, which really supports a lot of artists of color, a lot of touring work, and also folks who fall into, what you would say is like really unseen and marginalized work. And so I would check it out in pn.web. The conference is open to anyone who wants to apply to that, and we're going to be rocking that in December. The other one I mentioned was the Confest Hawaii 2020, and that is going on from August 7th through the 16th. It is also open to everybody, just in terms of there's going to be like an application process coming up for the submission of work and panels. The panels, panels and work as broadly defined. It is not like specifically focused, I would say like the conference is not specifically focused on any one thing, except that we do know that we are highlighting the work of Native Hawaiian artists and Pacific Islander artists, but also to talk about coalition building there in Hawaii and for the Pacific Rim. But there's a lot of room for these kind of cross-cultural and cross-coalition conversations within that. So we're going to be taking proposals for all of that starting fairly soon, and I think registration is open, and we have a job for someone in Hawaii, if anyone wants to kind of rock that with us.
I want to shout out Kata it has a history of being inclusive of Middle Eastern theater. And yes, because in 2016, when it was at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, the National Asian American Theater Festival included a pre-conference that focused on our communities. And it's complicated because we were looking at, in that case, the frame of Southwest and Central Asia, which of course then leaves out North Africa. So at the last meeting in Chicago, we had a panel that was an open plenary for the whole Confest that was more inclusive of Middle Eastern and North African artists. So Kata has really been very mindful about being inclusive of our community, and I think wants to continue to be a convening space for those who can get themselves to Hawaii. So do we have other, I see Tracy over there. Yes, and then we'll do.
I found the BTN, for those who are interested, has a call for papers. It's in July in Detroit. And I think just if you recognize that if it leaves out North Africa and then we pick it up, right? And then North Africa ends up in the Black theater, that I think we just keep our eyes open for that intersectionality, that all of our dreams will come true.
Tracy, go ahead.
I was going to bring in, so we've been talking a lot about like our ideas for whatever our group will be, and about advocating for work for artists and also for creating greater visibility. I want to see if there, other than the convenings, if there are initiatives or actions that you guys have taken in your coalition that were either successful or not successful, and just kind of brainstorming some ideas that you guys have done that maybe we can borrow from.
We used to publish a blog called Cafe Onda. That was another initiative that came out of those early meetings that has been absorbed into Greater HowlRound and the HowlRound Journal. But that's an idea. It was a volunteer editorial board. We did raise money to contract out some for an editor who was Georgina Escobar for a time. And that was an interesting thing where we set the parameters for the conversation that we were having online, where that could be disseminated. The hashtag still makes it into all of our convenings, hashtag Cafe Onda, but yeah.
Well, I think we're about to start a blog because you have to write it right now. Right? You're the first one. Share this responsibility, important responsibility. But
I think I've just been voluntold.
But yeah, I think it's also about building up that kind of online presence. Hopefully with the new ED, with really focusing on what what are the, how is the continuity carried out between the live interactions? Or we always use other conferences in order to try to get together too. And so attending, attending like the encuentros, or attending, any types of opportunities where a group of us can continue to build. We usually do this. We would love to kind of formalize our little touring circuit. What I was going to say for artists coming from California, of course, if you go to CCI Arts, there's a quick grant program, which for artists and companies, you can apply for professional development opportunities and have it somewhat subsidized. So I would encourage everybody in the room to, as you hear about all of these opportunities, to kind of expand your learning, to really think about it in that way.
Yeah.
If you're building a coalition, it makes sense for you to attend some of these to see what it looks like in action.
Yeah.
And so for California, we're kind of lucky because we have some resources.
Yeah, so the question was some things that worked and some things that didn't work. So I just want to speak a little bit to what was failure. And we used to have a magazine too.
Should be allowed
A
to.
slick, shining, magazines fail. We used to have a beautiful Black theater network. We used to have a beautiful magazine called Black Mask. That's now like Jet and Ebony. It's like, you can find it at the library, but no more. And it hasn't necessarily been replaced by online. But I spoke earlier about some coalitions that don't exist anymore. And I think that the lessons I took from one of those was the one at the August Wilson Center in particular. Part of that was the August Wilson Center was also in trouble. And so we weren't able to gather that there again anymore. But also the steering committee reached out, and there was Crosscultural Coalition building, and NATA was there, the Asian American Theater Association from New York was there, and that was the first big kind of blow up. It's like, why are they here? What are we doing? I thought we were talking about us, and then these really uncomfortable conversations about Black theater were at the table, and the contribution from NATA was just like gone by the wayside, and that kind of idea. And I think out of that one of the reasons that didn't happen was that there was too much disagreement in that room around just what umbrella we were under, about who we were and who should be in the room, and who was, and not just NATA, but like even myself, like why are you here? Why are the academics here? Why are there, so I think a really clear vision is really, and an outcome for the next step is really important.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap.
Hello. Thank you so much for all your insights. So informative. I was wondering if you could comment and share your experiences with your kind of pre-planning before you had formal leadership and funds or a space or a convening. How did you get that all like started? Did you start with an online presence? Did you start with fundraising? Did you start by becoming a nonprofit? Anything about pre-structure that made this all really sustainable?
I just quickly, one of BTN's strengths was connecting itself to the National Black Theater Festival. So every National Black Theater Festival, which meets every other year, is preceded by a BTN conference, and then BTN has the regular conference in between years. So I think they gathered membership, visibility, and continuity through connecting themselves to the larger festival.
This is tough. In a similar way to how we're talking about a coalition, like a cross coalition, there's so much that's just kind of like tending to the ground so that it's fertile enough for something to spring up. That's so kind of like hard to name, because I think like folks were gathering under a tree at TCG or at AFA at a specific lunch table, or you know, like these are the ways. And then I mean, when Karen Zacarias convened those folks in DC, and it was just 8 folks who had this big dream for the Boston convening, or what became the Boston convening. That just like there was something ready to spring up, and so I mean, looking around at this room, I feel like it's happening. Food.
Yeah, food, I think, not for nothing, like, you know, food, put some snacks out and invite some people. Because the food will get them, yeah. I think that's really where it kind of starts.
The pre-stuff is, I think that, I think you've done a lot of the pre-stuff. I was able to attend the Theaters of Color Coalition building that was here a week ago.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago.
Which is, and a lot of the findings in terms of your steering committee or your the surveys that you were doing tells me that you've done your homework. You kind of know who's in the room, although potentially what you're doing is you're identifying other people who are not there who you definitely want to reach out to. So I think, one, you've done like an awesome amount of groundwork on that. As far as like the structure of it, I would just say Kata came out of a lot of those companies, those original companies holding pieces of it, meaning they would house the conference or they would house a conversation, and it's pretty much amongst looking at what are the collective assets that people have. It's like, who can share out this piece? And so when we've been able to convene in Minneapolis due to Pangea and companies there who were in Kata, it's really through them kind of hosting us. And so, and then yes, food. Food is the second part.
Coffee.
And drinks. And coffee. Food, drinks, and
So at the same time that the meeting was happening at Arena, the Kinan Valdez was traveling to different regions and putting out a call. There's an email address called Latino Alliance Now, and don't email it because nobody logs into it anymore. But the password was shared with the folks of the different regions, and so there was, you know how like people are archiving their email so fast. It was like a recognizable email that people would know what it was about. It would share out the notes, and different regions were able to log into it and able to kind of like go through and see like, oh, did this work, or like what agenda did they use? And so we were sharing a lot of information just through a shared email account. That was something that just came to mind. Ooh, that was a long time ago.
Wow, thank you. So we have to wrap up, but I want to give a shout out to Taranj and Golden Thread for hosting this Shannon, who unfortunately couldn't stay the whole time, but it was so important to have her with us for the beginning. And please give a hand to all of our panelists.
Thank you, everybody. So everyone, this brings us to the end of our gathering. Yay! We've had a lot of rich conversations. We have a lot of notes. The walls of the annex are covered in notes and to-do lists and next steps, some potential names for our coalition organization. So thank you for being here. Thank you for trusting us with this conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, and being generous with your ideas. Just so you know, the steering committee will be meeting this afternoon to basically draw up a plan for next steps. We have already kind of decided that we're going to have an online presence, so I think that's going to happen sooner rather than later. And the need for communication with the group has been brought up more than once, so I think that's going to be a priority for us as well. So stay tuned. We will be in touch.
Party.
Party on.
Will the annex be open for our little requests? Those little post-its? Yeah.
Yes, so I will open up the annex for some food sharing and snacking and final words of wisdom that you may want to contribute to the walls and for folks to pick up your belongings. Anything else?
Right now?
Shall we do a group photo with our guests?
Oh, brilliant idea! Brilliant idea. We want to thank HowlRound and say goodbye to everybody on HowlRound. And yeah, everyone gather on stage and let's take a group photo.
We're already.
But we have the lights are going to be that way. The lights will not be